So let's start with a question you've probably thought about, right? You walk into a class on the first day and you're wondering, is this professor going to be any good? How long does it take you to decide? A week? A few classes? What do you think?
How about 5 seconds? No, really. That's it. Research by a couple of psychologists, Rosenthal and Ambati, found that people could actually predict a professor's end-of-semester ratings just by watching a 5-second silent video clip of them. So what on earth is going on there?
Well, there's actually a name for this incredible ability. Psychologists call it thin slicing. It's our brain's wild knack for taking a super tiny piece of experience, a thin slice, and making a judgment that's often surprisingly accurate. Now, this isn't just a random guess. It's a real part of how our brain works. But, and this is a big but, it comes with a major catch. See, those snap judgments we make in just a few seconds, they have this incredibly powerful lasting effect. Once we form that first impression, it becomes almost impossible to change our minds. And the reason for that? Well, it has to do with this really powerful bias that's basically hardwired into our brains. It's called confirmation bias. The moment our brain latches onto an idea, say that a professor is warm or that a new coworker is kind of clueless, it immediately starts acting like a really biased detective. It goes out and actively looks for clues that prove its first impression was right, and it pretty much just ignores anything that says otherwise. This quote just nails how confirmation bias works in the real world. You can watch the exact same behavior and see two totally different things, all because of the label you were given beforehand. If someone's described as vivacious, you're going to look for signs of energy. But if they're described as someone who drinks too much, you're going to see something very different. Let's just break that down for a second. Imagine someone's bouncing around with a ton of energy. If you were told they're vivacious, you think, wow, so creative. But if you were told they drink too much, you might see that same exact energy as, insecure twitching, a sign of a real problem. The behavior doesn't change at all. The frame you're given changes everything. But here's where it gets really crazy. What if our judgments don't just interpret reality? What if they actually change it? Yeah, this is where we go from just seeing what we expect to see to actually causing what we expect to happen. Our beliefs about other people can literally become self-fulfilling prophecies. There's a name for this too. It's called the Pygmalion effect. And the idea is actually pretty simple, but it's so profound. When we believe someone is capable, when we expect them to succeed, that belief itself can cause them to perform better. Our expectation becomes part of their success. This amazing quote from George Bernard Shaw's play, which is actually where the effect gets its name, it just captures the whole idea perfectly. How we treat other people, which is driven by what we expect of them, can fundamentally shape who they turn out to be. And this isn't just some nice literary idea. It's been proven over and over in the real world. Okay, so check out this classic classroom experiment that shows this in action. Researchers went into a school and told teachers that certain students were bloomers, that they were about to have this huge intellectual growth spurt. Now, here's the twist. The students were picked completely at random, but because the teachers believed they were bloomers, they gave them more attention, more encouragement. And the result? Those randomly chosen kids actually saw their IQ scores go up. The expectation literally created the reality. All right, so we've seen how powerful our first impressions of individuals can be. But what happens when our brain starts applying these same mental shortcuts, not just to one person, but to entire groups of people? Well, that's when we land right in the middle of the complicated world of stereotypes. Now look, from a psychological standpoint, stereotypes are just a basic tool. Our brain has to categorize stuff to make sense of the world, right? You have a stereotype for chair. You know it's for sitting. That's a helpful shortcut. But the whole system gets really dangerous when we start applying these rigid and often totally inaccurate generalizations to complex human beings. They get fueled by that confirmation bias we talked about and can lead to some seriously unfair outcomes. And if you want a perfect real-world example of that unfair impact, look no further than major symphony orchestras. For years, they were almost entirely male. But then, they started doing blind auditions, where musicians played behind a screen. And all of a sudden, the number of women getting hired just skyrocketed. The screen didn't make them play any better, it just stopped the judges from being able to act on their hidden biases. But the effects of stereotypes aren't always that obvious. Sometimes they are so subtle, so weird, that something as simple as a form you fill out before a test can actually lower your score. I mean, how is that even possible?
The answer is this phenomenon called stereotype threat, which was pioneered by the psychologist Claude Steele. It's basically the pressure a person feels when they're in a situation where they worry they might confirm a negative stereotype about their own group. And that feeling of being at risk creates this anxiety that can really hurt their performance. And you won't believe how little it takes to set this off. Studies have shown that something as small as asking someone to check a box for their race or their gender right before a math test, that can be enough to trigger stereotype threat and actually cause their scores to drop. The stereotype itself becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So far, we've been talking about judgments and beliefs that are, at least somewhat conscious. But what about the biases that are running in the background? The ones that operate completely outside of our awareness? The ones we don't even know are there? A good way to think about this is like an iceberg. At the very top, above the water, is the public level. That's the stuff we say out loud. Just below the surface is the private level, what we might actually believe, but, we keep to ourselves. But the biggest, most powerful part is deep underwater. That's the implicit level. These are unconscious associations our brain just makes automatically, without our permission. And this is where the real work begins. Now, you can't just ask people about these biases, right? Because they're unconscious. So psychologists had to create tools like the implicit association test, which measures how fast our brain makes these automatic connections. And the research here is, well, it's pretty sobering. These hidden biases have huge real-world consequences, affecting everything from who gets a job interview to life or death decisions made in a split second. So how does this even work? Well, according to psychologist Trish Devine, when we see a person from a certain group, the stereotypes associated with that group are just automatically switched on in our brains. This isn't a moral failure. It's not something you choose to do. It's a cognitive reflex. It just happens. And this right here, this brings us to what might be the most important point of all. Because that activation is automatic. Being a fair person isn't just something you are, it's something you do. It's an active process. To stop ourselves from acting on these automatic stereotypes, we have to consciously, deliberately push back against them. It takes real mental work to override our brain's automatic settings. So this all leaves us with a really important final question. If our brains are just wired for these shortcuts, and if being fair requires this constant, conscious effort to fight against them, then maybe we should stop thinking about fairness as a virtue that we either have or we don't. Maybe it's a skill, something that we can all practice and get better at with a little bit of work.